What would a blockchain-based version of Amazon look like? To give you a sense for where I'm going with this, first I'm going to talk about why we would want to disrupt Amazon and why the government might not necessarily be up for the job. Then I'll talk a little bit about blockchain and the features of that technology that might help to disrupt Amazon. Then I want to talk about capital because I'm an economist and I think there's different types of capital that are empowering Amazon. And some of those are the sources of power that Amazon's using to create this stronghold for its monopoly. So we particularly need to focus on those sources of capital. And then finally, I'll just give you a vision of what would a disrupted version of Amazon look like? What would a blockchain-based version actually look like? And finally, I'll give a hint about how we might actually get there as a society. So first, why disrupt Amazon? What's the problem with the current monopoly power of Amazon? And my guess is if you're watching this video, you probably have a sense for what that is. It's really the same problem that has always been the case with monopolies, where they have too much power against workers and they can have working conditions that are not great. We've seen that unions are not necessarily successful at negotiating against Amazon, so that's one piece of the puzzle. But there's also the deal with that company having too much power over which small businesses succeed and which fail. And sometimes Amazon even sort of undercuts small businesses by buying up the business in a predatory way or using the algorithms that show which products show at the top, which products don't, in a way that is not necessarily pro-competition from the perspective of small businesses. And then there's also just the problem of too much power which potentially could be wielded politically. If we're worried about supply chain disruptions and economic-based attacks on the United States or attacks on any country, really, a company that has as much market power and power over the supply chain and the economic system as Amazon does, that's a vulnerability. So those are three possible reasons why we might want to disrupt Amazon, potentially with a blockchain-based version of something similar. Now, the next question, of course, is why can't the government just do this? And of course, the government could actually disrupt Amazon. As a matter of fact, there's parts of the government that are supposed to be antitrust-based. The Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission could technically go after Amazon, potentially break it up, potentially go against some of the anti-competitive behaviors within Amazon. But one problem we're seeing, I think, is regulatory capture, where it makes a lot of sense for Amazon to invest money lobbying the government and convincing people in the government that it's in the country's best interest to have policies that really are not, that are really in Amazon's best interest. So maybe the government could do some of this, but this video is really about what if we don't believe the government will, for whatever reason, regulatory capture or whatnot. What can we do about it by implementing a blockchain? So next, I would like to talk about blockchain and the features of blockchain that might help with disrupting Amazon. And of course, blockchain is not the only technology that could do this. It's just the technology I think people are most familiar with. So the biggest feature of blockchain that is going to make this kind of thing possible is going to be the fact that blockchain will make it easier for people to collectively own something, and in particular, for them to collectively own digital assets. Now, this actually mirrors the way that shareholders collectively own a company. And that technology has been around for years, or that way of organizing businesses was around long before companies. We just have these contracts that say, you own 1/10,000th of the company, and if you're not given 1/10,000th of the profits that year, the courts will enforce that contract. So that's why you don't actually need a blockchain to make this happen. If you have the courts that are willing to sort of uphold shared ownership of an asset, then you can have something like I'm going to describe here. But blockchain is really good at enforcing contracts, having smart contracts built on top of the blockchain, and so it enables just very smooth enforcement of shared ownership of an asset. Now, in my other videos on social media, I talk about how with social media, most of the assets in those social media companies are digital. So if we have shared ownership of, for example, the social media space, then we can have shared governance, and it can sort of act like a democratic space in ways that are helpful if we want to disrupt the corporate power that has too much say. So something similar is going to happen with Amazon, but Amazon is actually a little bit different than these other big tech companies because a larger share of its assets and a larger share of its market power is in the category of classic economies of scale. It just owns a lot of real-world physical capital. We're talking about the trucks it owns, the warehouses it owns. All of that stuff is a bigger share of the company. Okay, so let me pull up the diagram I like to use to talk about different types of capital within a company. And of course, capital from an economist's perspective is going to be like actual stuff that the company uses to produce its product. So here we have network capital, which is basically the most powerful type of capital for all of the tech monopolies. And network capital is access to other people on the network. In this case, with Amazon, it's going to be access to the many, many different sellers of products. And these are small businesses, these are large businesses, all kinds of businesses that contract with Amazon. So if you want to buy from any of those, the most convenient place to go is Amazon. That's network capital. There's also physical capital, which, like I said, is one of the big differences between Amazon and social media tech giants. There's human capital, which is just the education and the skills of the workers in those companies. There's reputational capital, which is just the reputation that the company has built up over time, which engenders trust between the people using the company's services and the company. And that trust needs to be from a long history that the people have with the company so that they feel completely comfortable buying stuff, knowing that it will be returned, knowing that that company is going to follow through on its commitments. All of that kind of stuff you need to build up through both advertising and experience in the past. Now, similar to reputational capital, we have mental infrastructure, which is just the population's understanding about how Amazon works. Like, how do you research things on Amazon? How does the rating system work? All of the understanding the population has about how to interact with the system, that's a type of capital. And then, of course, there's information capital, where information capital is the algorithms that decide which products should it bring to the top. It's the data it has on you and your purchasing behavior. And that data is useful to Amazon because it can predict your behavior and sort of get the ball rolling on ordering the stuff it needs ahead of time, so that when you finally buy something, it has it in stock and ready to go. Now, if we're going to think about disrupting Amazon, we need to think about what are the sources of power Amazon has that we might want to disrupt. And I identify 4 key sources of power. One is the network capital. It's just the fact that Amazon has negotiated with so many different sellers. Second is the information capital. And this includes information on product quality. That, of course, if you're going to buy something, you want to research it online. And how many of us just go to Amazon and look at the reviews there rather than doing our own research outside of Amazon? And of course, it's super convenient to just buy the product from Amazon after we've researched it. Then the third source of power is your data, of course. And the fourth source of power is its physical capital, the physical infrastructure that Amazon has built. All of the warehouses across the country, all of the trucks it owns, all of that is the physical infrastructure. Okay, now I would like to describe how a blockchain-based version of Amazon might look. And the key here is that some parts of this capital within Amazon would be collectively owned and governed by some group of people that's not just the Amazon shareholders. And one question you might ask is, who would actually govern Amazon? And there's going to be different answers to that. For example, maybe it's small businesses. Maybe Amazon on blockchain becomes something where it's owned by any company that's between a certain size that qualifies as a small business. And they use the infrastructure of Amazon as sort of an economic commons to support small businesses and to support sort of a competitive environment. That's one way this could look. It could also be that the users have some sort of stake. It could also be that the people who work for any organization associated with Amazon have some kind of stake. So we might imagine if the ownership belongs collectively, let's say, to customers, small businesses, and workers, and let's say the owners of the capital, that would be the classic shareholders. Let's say those four groups all have some kind of vote in how the Amazon shared space works. And you could imagine different percentages of these votes. For example, maybe each of those four groups gets 25% of the vote. Maybe small businesses get 50% of the vote and large businesses get 10% of the vote, and then the rest is split among shareholders and whatnot. You could have shareholders or the people who own the physical capital or own the small businesses. Those people could have 50% of the vote. Basically, how you break down the ownership of the governance of this online space that's the new blockchain Amazon, there's so many different ways of doing that. So I'm not going to debate those different ways here. I'm just trying to set up a vision of what this might look like. Okay, next, I think it would be helpful for us to think about an analogy. So I would like you to either think about a food court or a marketplace where a bunch of artists and small businesses come and have their little stand. I'm sure you've been to marketplaces like that where you can buy vegetables and arts and crafts and whatnot. And the online space that looks like the current version of Amazon, that would be analogous to the physical space of that marketplace or that food court, where there's rules that govern interactions in that space. There's rules about how you set up your little tent to sell things, but the space is there to sort of serve the needs of the small businesses that are selling in that space. And when we think of that economic commons, that would include things like product rating systems and the algorithms that sort of help consumers figure out which products are best. It would include shared ownership of people's data to predict what kinds of products people will buy in the future. Now, of course, you're going to have rules that govern privacy of that data, rules that govern use of that data for profit, even for profit of these wonderful small businesses. But instead of those rules being set by a board of directors that's only accountable to the shareholders of Amazon, the new board of directors would simply be elected by the small businesses or the users of Amazon, the blockchain Amazon that is, or some other group that has other interests besides just Amazon dominating the world. And you notice here that I'm talking a lot about governance. In some ways, we're talking about mixing capitalist endeavors, mixing market-based competition with more democratic ways of governing those market spaces. Now, that's always been the case. The government has always been responsible for monitoring market-based spaces, making sure markets were competitive, taking lawsuits against anti-competitive monopolists. That's always been within the realm of the government's responsibility. But many of us believe that the government has not fulfilled some of these promises to the public to make sure that these big companies don't just take over and have too much power. And if you're worried about that, this system would be a way of having almost a private space that's a space for economic activity that's governed by some group of people, but that still supports commerce. That's the general idea here. So if we're trying to envision this, we might envision the stuff that's collectively owned is the data, the access to other people in the network, that is other small businesses, other sellers, other consumers who are going to patron these businesses, that group of people and the rules that govern them, the data they generate, the algorithms that govern that space, all of that is collectively owned. But then, of course, because Amazon has a lot of physical capital and physical things it needs to do, things like shipping and warehouse storage and just the physical business of Amazon, that could be owned by small businesses or maybe a few large competing businesses. Like maybe one of the rules of use of this online space that's the new Amazon blockchain marketplace, one of the rules is that there needs to be at least 5 options for shippers, for people to ship your content. And of course, is it the consumer who makes the decision between the 5, or is it the board of directors that we've democratically elected? Well, I don't know the answer to that. My guess is consumers don't want to involve themselves in the day-to-day management of that kind of thing. Consumers care a lot about convenience. So maybe consumers don't make those decisions, but the people who do make those decisions, at least they're elected by some version of the people or the small businesses. So we're imagining a bunch of smaller companies, and maybe by smaller that means 5 big companies that are all competing, but they still have access to this space that's Amazon. And these companies, of course, can build up reputations, just like if you sell things on eBay, you develop a reputation as a seller. And the problem right now is that eBay owns that reputation. So even if you have worked really hard to be a great small business on eBay, you're underneath their jurisdiction in a way that you cannot take your reputation over to Amazon and use it there. And vice versa. If you've developed a reputation with Amazon, you can't transfer that to a different company. And I think giving more rights to the people who have worked hard to develop their reputations as a seller to take that reputation elsewhere and use it on a different competing blockchain Amazon-based marketplace, I think that would be a right that the people and the small businesses might want to uphold. So I think that's enough. I could go on and on explaining this. The last thing I want to say is that if this sounds kind of cool to you, but you're like, how would we ever get there? Amazon would never let this kind of thing happen. Well, I think one of the things that we could do to disrupt these companies is develop smart contracts that will help people work together in collective action. So my guess is some people might say, well, I would be willing to pay 10% more for a couple of years to buy stuff on a marketplace like this until this new Amazon competitor that's on a blockchain sort of got its feet off the ground. And maybe other people would say, you know what, I'm willing to pay 50% more for a few months. So if people thought carefully about what kinds of sacrifices they might be willing to make this new blockchain-based Amazon disruption happen, you could get a coordination system that uses game theory to try to almost enforce people's willingness. If you say, I'm willing to work with an inconvenient user interface for 6 months, if it's going to help move all the power from Amazon to a more democratic economic space, then if there was a way of enforcing that such that people actually did that, you probably could disrupt Amazon even without government intervention. So that's the kind of thing I think we need to be thinking more about. It's the kind of thing that I'm trying to create a vision for on this channel.